You won't believe what this woman did to turn heartbreak into power, and rewrite her life at 53. My name is Margaret Hayes. I'm 50 years old, and I live in a modest apartment above a flower shop in Portland, Oregon. On weekdays, I work as a part-time receptionist at a small dental clinic downtown. On weekends, I volunteer at the local animal shelter. People who meet me now often describe me as calm, gentle, reliable. But that's just the surface. What they don't know is that this version of me, the quiet woman who arranges her bookshelf by color and knows how to make soup from scratch, took decades to build. Piece by piece. Scar by scar. I wasn't always this way. There was a time when I spoke quickly, dreamed boldly, and believed that anything was possible. That time feels like a different life now, faded at the edges, like an old photograph curling in the corners. Still, it lives in me, quietly. Like an ember. This is the story of how that ember caught fire again. Of how I lost everything I thought made me who I was, my career, my marriage, even my sense of worth, and somehow found something deeper. This isn't a success story wrapped in a bow. It's a map through the mess. If you've ever looked at your reflection and whispered, "I don't know who I am anymore," then this story is for you. Because I've been there. And if you're willing to sit with me for a while, I'll tell you how I climbed out, slowly, painfully, honestly. And how I came back to life. When I was 19, the world felt like a blank canvas, and I held the brush. I had just started college at a small liberal arts school in Washington State. I was the first in my family to go to college, and I carried that pride like a badge of honor. My parents were blue-collar, salt-of-the-earth people, my dad a mechanic, my mom a waitress. We didn't have much, but they gave me everything that mattered: work ethic, humility, and a stubborn kind of hope. Back then, I wanted to become a writer. Not the famous kind with book tours and bestsellers. I didn't even dream that big. I just wanted to tell stories. Real ones. Human ones. I wanted to make people feel seen. I majored in English and spent hours in the library, getting lost in Toni Morrison, Sylvia Plath, Joan Didion. I filled journal after journal with half-finished poems and short stories. My professors told me I had a voice, raw, honest, full of potential. At night, I'd walk to the local coffee shop where they hosted open mic readings. That's where I met Daniel. He was a philosophy major with kind eyes and a crooked smile. He played acoustic guitar and quoted Rilke in casual conversation. I fell hard and fast, the way only someone that young and untouched by heartbreak can fall. We'd stay up until 3 a.m. talking about books and dreams and the kind of lives we'd live someday. He said we were twin flames. I believed him. Together, we dreamed of moving to a big city, maybe Seattle or Chicago. We'd get a tiny apartment with books stacked against every wall. I'd write. He'd teach. We'd grow old creating something meaningful, something that mattered. For a while, it felt possible. I still remember the night he surprised me with a leather-bound notebook. Inside the front cover, he had written, "To Margaret, who sees the world in sentences. Don't ever stop." And I didn't want to. I was full of fire, naive, idealistic, unstoppable. But fire, as I'd come to learn, is a dangerous thing when you don't know what you're feeding it. Looking back now, that girl feels both close and distant. Like an echo through time. She had no idea what was coming. No idea how life could crack you open and ask you to rebuild from the inside out. But she was brave. And for a long time, that bravery carried me. It happened in the fall of my senior year. Daniel and I had been together for nearly 3 years. We shared everything: books, dreams, a beat-up Toyota with a broken radio. I had already pictured the rest of my life with him. I was certain. The way only a 22-year-old can be certain about love. We had just signed a lease on a tiny apartment above a bakery downtown. It smelled like bread in the mornings, and we thought it was perfect. A starting point. A seed for the life we were going to grow. But seeds don't grow without truth. And I hadn't seen the cracks forming. Daniel started staying out later, blaming study groups and late-night coffee runs. He stopped asking me to read his papers, stopped bringing me books with little notes in the margins. His kisses got shorter. His hugs, distracted. I asked him once if everything was okay, and he laughed, too quickly. "Margaret, not everything's a story." I remember that line more clearly than anything he wrote in those years. One afternoon, I came home early from class, arms full of groceries and fresh flowers from the market. I unlocked the apartment door quietly, planning to surprise him. But it was me who was surprised. There was laughter. A woman's voice. And then, Daniel's. I stood frozen in the hallway, listening as my future burned itself down in real time. When I finally stepped inside, they both looked at me like I was the intruder. The girl scrambled to grab her coat. Daniel looked inconvenienced. He didn't beg. He didn't apologize. He just said, "I didn't think you'd be home yet." That was it. No drama. No confession. Just a slow, cold unraveling of everything I thought was real. I moved out that night. Slept on a friend's couch for 2 weeks, then in my car for 3 days after she moved in with her boyfriend. I skipped classes. Cried into my coffee. I didn't tell my parents. I was too ashamed. Not because I'd been cheated on. But because I had believed it wouldn't happen to me. That heartbreak sent shockwaves through everything. Not just my relationship, but my sense of self. If I was wrong about Daniel, what else was I wrong about? My future? My writing? My worth? My final semester became a blur of missed deadlines and panic attacks I didn't have words for. I graduated, barely. No celebration. No cap and gown photo. Just a quiet exit from the life I had imagined. I got a job at a diner just outside of town, waiting tables to make rent. I stopped writing. I threw the leather-bound notebook in a box I wouldn't open again for years. The world no longer felt like a canvas. It felt like a wall. Gray. Blank. Silent. The apartment I found was barely bigger than a walk-in closet. The ceiling leaked when it rained, the heater rattled like an old engine, and the view from the window was a brick wall. But it was mine, or at least, mine for $475 a month and a job that kept my feet aching and my smile glued on like cheap lipstick. I thought time would heal me. That's what people say, right? Time heals all wounds. But they never mention how much silence comes with that time. Or how healing doesn't feel like mending, it feels like forgetting. Forgetting what it was like to be excited. To be seen. To be someone. My life became a loop. Wake up. Work. Go home. Watch TV. Sleep. Repeat. No writing. No reading. Not even dreaming. The notebook stayed in the box, shoved into the back of a closet I barely opened. Every time I passed it, I felt a flicker of shame, like walking by a mirror when you've forgotten how to look yourself in the eye. Friends drifted. Or maybe I did. Group texts stopped including me. Invitations faded. I told myself they were busy. That I was fine. But the truth? I was lonely in a way that felt physical. Like something pressing down on my chest every night before I slept. At the diner, I smiled for customers and remembered their coffee orders like it was a sacred skill. Black with 2 sugars, Miss Annie. Extra cream, no judgment, Mr. Lee. They liked me. I was dependable. Polite. Invisible. No one knew that I sometimes sat in the break room staring at the wall, wondering how my life had turned into a background track with no melody. There was a moment, I still remember it. I was cleaning tables near the window just before closing. Rain streaked the glass. A couple walked by, holding hands, laughing. Young, wet from the rain, careless in the way only people still full of hope can be. And I felt nothing. Not envy. Not longing. Just emptiness. It scared me more than any pain ever had. Because at least pain meant you still cared. I called my mom that night. I told her I was okay, which was mostly a lie. She asked if I was still writing. I said I didn't have time, which was completely a lie. What I meant was, I don't know who I am anymore. But I couldn't say that. I didn't even know how to begin. At 24, I felt 70. Heavy with years I hadn't lived, only endured. I tried dating again once or twice, but every conversation felt like I was auditioning for a version of myself I no longer believed in. I'd laugh at the right moments, say the right things, then go home and cry for no reason at all. I wasn't depressed, not exactly. But I wasn't alive either. I was surviving. Functioning. Drifting through days like they were fog. Sometimes I'd walk around the bookstore on Main Street, running my fingers across the spines of novels I used to love. I'd wonder what it felt like to believe in a story again. To create one. To be inside something bigger than tip money and cold dinners. But then I'd leave, empty-handed. Because somewhere along the way, I'd stopped believing I had anything worth saying. And when you lose your voice, the world gets very quiet. It happened on a Tuesday. One of those gray, forgettable days where time feels like it's moving sideways. I was on my lunch break, sitting alone on the bench outside the diner, chewing on a sandwich I didn't want. The sky was low and heavy, threatening rain, and my feet ached from the morning rush. I was scrolling my phone aimlessly, news, sales, strangers' lives, when a voice cut through the quiet. "Is that the house on Ash Lane?" I looked up, confused. An older woman with wild silver hair and round glasses was standing in front of me, pointing at the paperback lying beside me. I had pulled it from the breakroom shelf weeks ago, meaning to read it, but never got past page 10. Yeah, I said. Trying to finish it. She smiled. "That book saved me once." Funny how stories can do that, isn't it? I nodded politely, expecting her to keep walking. But she didn't. Instead, she sat beside me like we were old friends. "I'm Ruth," she said. "You look like someone who's forgotten how brilliant she is." I blinked, unsure whether to laugh or cry. "That obvious?" She chuckled. "Only to those who've been there." We talked for 20 minutes, about books, rain, how people lose themselves in the middle of ordinary lives. She told me she was a retired teacher, newly widowed, and now volunteering at the library's creative writing program. "You ever write?" she asked. I hesitated. "I used to. When I was younger." "Well," she said, patting my knee, "maybe it's time you remember who that girl was." Then she stood, handed me a card, and walked away. Just like that. The card was simple. Thursdays, 6 p.m., Community Library Writing Circle. Beginners welcome. All stories matter. I carried it in my pocket for 3 days, unfolding and refolding it like a prayer. Part of me said no. Too late. Too tired. You don't belong there anymore. But something, tiny and stubborn, whispered, "Just try." That Thursday, I walked to the library after my shift, palms sweating, heart hammering. I almost turned around twice. But when I stepped into the room, there she was, Ruth, sitting at a round table, smiling like she'd been waiting for me. There were 6 other people. All ages, all types. None of them professionals. Just humans with stories burning quietly in their chests. That night, I wrote for the first time in years. The words didn't flow easily. My hand cramped. My voice shook. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something crack open. Like a window, long sealed shut, letting in a single, precious breeze. I wasn't better. I wasn't fixed. But I had a place to begin. And sometimes, that's all it takes. The Thursday night writing circle became my anchor. Each week, I showed up with shaking hands and a notebook that smelled like coffee and old paper. The first few times, I barely shared anything. Just listened. Took notes. Let the words of strangers stitch something inside me back together. But little by little, I began to read my work aloud. Small stories, short paragraphs, fragments of a life I hadn't dared to name. I wrote about waitressing, about loneliness, about a woman who forgot how to speak until she started scribbling words on napkins. Ruth would nod each time, her gaze warm and unwavering. She never praised out of politeness. Only when it mattered. "You've got something," she said one evening, after I read a short piece about a waitress who cried in the freezer. "But more than that, you've got something to say." No one had said that to me in years. Something shifted that night. I walked home and sat at my tiny kitchen table, staring at my calloused hands and thought, if I don't try now, when? The next morning, I Googled adult writing courses. There were hundreds. Most were expensive. Some were scams. But eventually, I found a community college offering a night class on creative nonfiction. The tuition was manageable if I cut back. I called. Registered. Marked the date on a sticky note and stuck it to the fridge. That small yellow square became my promise to myself. The first few weeks were brutal. My mind felt like a rusted machine, grinding back to life. I'd come home exhausted after shifts at the diner, barely able to focus, fighting off that old voice. "You're too old for this. You're a waitress. What do you think you're doing?" But I kept showing up. I wrote in the margins of receipts. On the backs of grocery lists. I borrowed books from the library and read them in the bath. I stopped watching mindless TV and started journaling again, not just prayers or sadness, but goals. Tiny ones. Like. Write 500 words without editing. Ask one question in class. Apply for a small writing contest, even if you lose. Some nights, I cried. When my rent went up. When I burned dinner. When a customer snapped at me and I couldn't fight back. But I didn't quit. Ruth checked in weekly. She brought me used books. Told me about local author talks. One night, she said, "You know, there's a contest at the library. 2,000 words. You should enter." I laughed. "I'm not ready." She smiled. "Nobody ever is." I spent 3 nights writing that piece, about a waitress who once wanted to be a writer and how she found her voice again in a cold library room with strangers who became family. I didn't win. But they published it on the library's website. My name. My words. Public. Real. One morning at the diner, a young woman tapped the counter where I was pouring coffee. She looked nervous. "Are you Margaret?" she asked. "I read your story. The one on the library site. It meant a lot." I blinked. "You read that?" She nodded. "Yeah. It made me feel less alone." And just like that, everything was worth it. Not because I became famous. Not because I made money. But because something I wrote mattered to someone. A stranger. A girl who saw herself in me. That's when I knew. This wasn't just a hobby. This was who I was. Not a waitress. Not an ex-wife. Not a footnote in someone else's story. A writer. And I was just getting started. I remember the morning like a bruise. Gray sky, colder than usual. I had just sent out my first manuscript, a collection of short stories, stitched together from memories, regrets, and bits of courage, to a small publishing house. I didn't expect a miracle. Just a chance. They rejected it. Not gently. Not kindly. Just a cold, impersonal email that ended with a line that hit like a slap. "We don't believe this work is commercially viable." I read it 3 times. My hands hovered over the mouse. My breath caught somewhere between my chest and throat. I had poured everything I had into those pages. Sleepless nights, lunch breaks at the cafe scrawling in notebooks, tears that stained the margins. Every line was a piece of me I'd dared to show. And now it felt like none of it mattered. I shut the laptop. For weeks, I couldn't write. I'd sit at my small wooden desk, stare at the blank screen, and feel a familiar voice creeping in. Who do you think you are? Writing is for dreamers. You're 48. It was a fluke that you even started. I stopped attending Ruth's writing group. Stopped responding to texts. Worked extra shifts at the cafe, not because I needed the money, but because I didn't want to be alone with myself. Then one evening, after a long shift, I came home and found a small envelope slipped under my door. It was from Ruth. Inside was a single sheet of paper. One line typed in the center. Failure is not the opposite of success. It's the rehearsal. Underneath, in her crooked handwriting. I hope you come back to class. Not because your story was perfect, but because you were brave enough to tell it. I didn't cry right away. Just stood there holding the note, something inside me softening, melting. The next morning, I made tea. I took out the old manuscript and read it cover to cover. And yes, it had flaws. It rambled in places. It was raw. But it was real. And more importantly, it was a beginning. I opened my laptop. Not to edit. But to write. From scratch. For me. Because I finally understood something no rejection letter could take away. A writer isn't someone who gets accepted. A writer is someone who keeps writing. It happened on a Sunday morning, quiet, soft, unremarkable at first. I was sitting in the cafe, as usual. Same table near the window, same chipped coffee mug. I had just finished scribbling a short piece in my notebook. A story about a woman who packed her grief into a suitcase and traveled until she forgot what it felt like to stay. Ruth walked in. She waved, ordered her usual, then sat across from me without asking. I read your newest story, she said. I blinked. How? You left your notebook at last week's session. My stomach dropped. That notebook was sacred. Private. Messy. But Ruth smiled. I loved it. I read it 3 times. I didn't know what to say. I mumbled something about how it wasn't finished, how it was too raw, too weird, too much. And then she said it. You should share it. My immediate reaction was panic. You mean, online? She nodded. A blog. A newsletter. Something small. Not to be famous. Just to be heard. I hesitated. I'd never put my words out in the world before, not like that. But something inside me stirred. Not fear this time, but curiosity. That night, I created a free blog. Simple. No photos. No bio. Just a title. Stories from the second half. I uploaded the story. Then I closed the laptop and didn't think about it again. Until the next morning, when I checked my email and saw this. 34 views. 12 likes. 5 comments. From strangers. One said, "This made me cry in the best way." Another wrote, "I feel seen. Thank you." It wasn't viral. It didn't change my life overnight. But it changed something inside me. Because for the first time, my voice, shaky, scared, honest, had reached someone. And maybe that's how change begins. Not with applause. Not with fame. But with a single person whispering, "Me too." That week, I wrote more. Not for approval. For connection. And slowly, word by word, I started to build a bridge between who I was and who I was becoming. The blog grew slowly, like ivy up a brick wall. Quiet but steady. Each week, I posted another story. Sometimes fiction. Sometimes memoir. Always honest. I didn't filter the messy parts, the loneliness, the doubt, the longing. And maybe that's why people kept reading. 6 months in, I had over 2,000 subscribers. people began emailing me. Women from all over the world, a retired nurse in Scotland, a single mom in Ohio, a widowed teacher in New Zealand. They all said the same thing, in different ways. Thank you for putting into words what I couldn't. One day, I received a message from a woman named Ingrid, who worked for a small publishing press focused on memoirs by women over 40. She had read one of my posts, the day I forgot how to be small, and asked if I'd ever considered turning my stories into a book. My first reaction? Laughter. Me? A book? But something inside me, something stronger now, whispered, why not? We met. We talked. And 3 months later, I signed a contract for my first book. The second half, Notes on Starting Over. The day the first copy arrived in the mail, I cried holding it. Not because it was perfect, but because it was real. A piece of my life, bound and titled. Proof that the broken pieces could make something beautiful. The book didn't become a bestseller. But it sold steadily. Bookstores stocked it in their late bloomers section. Book clubs began reading it. A few podcasts invited me to speak. I never imagined I'd be the one sharing my story, not as a cautionary tale, but as a roadmap. I moved into a slightly bigger apartment. Nothing fancy. But the walls were filled with paintings again, mine. I began teaching beginner art classes at the community center, where I met women who hadn't picked up a brush in 30 years. Every Saturday, Eleanor and I would meet for coffee and gossip about life, men, and what color to dye her hair next. Silver is sexy now, she'd wink. My daughter sent me a photo of herself at a rally, holding a sign that read, my mom taught me how to start over. My son called one night just to ask, how are you, Mom? And waited for the real answer. And for the first time in decades, I had one. I was good. Not perfect. Not unbreakable. But whole. In my own way. Every morning, I still wake up early. I sit by the window with my coffee, in the same old blue chair. I sketch. I write. I breathe. This is the life I built, not the one I was handed, not the one I was told to accept. And it's enough. If you're listening to this, maybe while folding laundry, sitting alone in your car, or staring at your ceiling wondering where the time went, I want you to hear me clearly. It is not too late.